Hi everybody. In this unit we're going to look at the ferns and the horsetails and the main features that we can use to identify them, and then we'll take a look at how we can use these plants in the landscape. By the end of this unit you'll be able to describe the main physical characteristics that we use in the identification of the true ferns and describe ways in which ferns can be incorporated into our ornamental landscapes. Ferns belong to the group of plants called the manilophytes, and you should already have learned a little bit about the manilophytes in the short UC Davis video in Canvas. The manilophytes have vascular tissue, roots, and stems, and the true ferns have true leaves, referred to as macrophylls, meaning large leaf. The manilophytes still share a similar reproductive system, though, with the earlier groups of plants, the bryophytes and the lycophytes. Even though the ferns are sometimes referred to as primitive plants because of their less sophisticated reproductive system, they're still a really successful group of plants, as evidenced by their widespread existence today. Let's take a quick look at the reproductive system of the ferns. It's not necessary for you to know the details of how ferns produce, or reproduce rather, but having some knowledge of it helps us understand why so many ferns are found in moist, shady habitats. Sexual reproduction in ferns involves an alternation of generations, where there are separate, free-living gametophyte and sporophyte, or spore-bearing generations. Fertilization takes place externally, away from the mother plant, unlike the seed-bearing plants where the embryo is retained by the mother plant and fertilized in situ. The fern that we're all familiar with is the diploid sporophyte generation, pictured at the lower left of the diagram on the right here. This is the plant that we buy in nurseries and plant in our landscapes. This sporophyte fern produces bisexual spores, which are released and usually dispersed by wind and water. If and when these spores land in a suitable environment, they germinate and produce a structure called a prothallus, which you can see here on the right. The prothallus is tiny, maybe just a few millimeters across and just one cell thick, so it's really vulnerable to drying out. In time, the prothallus produces both male and female structures, which produce sperm and eggs. The sperm are motile and need free water to swim their way to a receptive female egg. This necessity for free water and the prothallus's vulnerability to desiccation are why so many ferns are found growing in moist, shady habitats, such as our coast redwood forests in California. This slide shows a mature deer fern on the left, and on the right, a highly magnified prothallus, which is that free-living haploid generation. A significant number of ferns are also able to reproduce vegetatively or clonally. Some reproduce by rhizomes, such as our California native Polypodium californicum. Others produce plantlets or bulblets on their fronds. One of the most common ferns that's available in the nursery trade in California that does this is the mother fern, Asplenium bulbariferum, which is native to New Zealand and produces plantlets on its fronds, as shown in the photo on the right. Anderson's holly fern, which is native to the Pacific Northwest, produces small bulblets towards the tip of its fronds. When the fronds are pressed to the ground, they root and form new plants that are clones of the parent. The walking ferns have fronds that are strongly arching. The tips of the arched fronds are able to root when they're in contact with the soil and then produce new clonal plantlets. Examples of the walking ferns that do this are Asplenium rhizophyllum, which is native to eastern North America, and Asplenium sibericum, which is native to eastern Asia. Worldwide, there are about 12,000 living species of ferns. Because successful reproduction is usually dependent on the presence of water, most ferns are found growing in moist, shady, forest, woodland, or riparian ecosystems. But there are ferns with adaptations to xeric habitats, such as species of Pellia, the cliff brakes, Pentagramma, and Calanthes, the lip ferns. Ferns can also be found growing in a range of different substrates. Many ferns are geophytic, meaning they grow in the ground, but some are epiphytic, meaning they grow on other plants, and some are epipetric, which means they grow on rocks. And the smallest fern, Azolla, is aquatic. On the right, you can see a photo, which is actually a terrible photo, but it shows the adaptability of ferns. It's a species of Calanthes growing in a crack in this large rock in a really dry, hot desert ecosystem on the outskirts of Phoenix in Arizona. As well as growing in a range of habitats, ferns also exhibit a range of growth habits and sizes. Clumping ferns are probably the most commonly planted fern in cultivated landscapes, but there are also ferns with running growth habits that spread by rhizomes, such as bracken fern, which you commonly see in the wild in Santa Cruz County. Our native California polypody also spreads by thick rhizomes to form dense colonies. The southern sword fern, which is a popular ornamental, also spreads by rhizomes and can become a nuisance in the landscape. And there are also arborescent or tree-like ferns. The most common ones available in California nurseries are Sphaeropteris cooperi, which was formerly Cyathea cooperi, the Australian tree fern, and the slightly more cold-hardy Dicksonia antarctica, the Tasmanian tree fern. So let's talk a little bit now about the fern relatives, the horsetails. The horsetails are also classified as ferns and are thought to be one of the first groups to diverge from the other ferns. There's just one extant family of horsetails, the Equisetaceae, that has just one genus, Equisetum, and about 15 species worldwide, of which 5 grow natively in California. There are 2 groups of horsetails. Firstly, there are the true horsetails, which have leaf-like structures branching off the stems, as shown in the photo here of giant horsetail in Nicene marks. And secondly, there are the horsetails known as the scouring rushes, which have silica deposits in their stems, which makes them abrasive, hence the common name. The leaves of the scouring rushes are arranged in whorls and are reduced to small, white, scale-like structures that you can see right here at the nodes on the black area of the stem. All the green tissue here is stem, which is ridged, and the stem is hollow between the nodes. Only one horsetail is commonly found in California nurseries, the scouring rush or Equisetum hyemale. It also grows naturally in Santa Cruz County, and you can often see it growing in places that are typically moist year-round. Scouring rush is another good example of a misleading common name, as the plant isn't botanically a rush. It just has round stems that superficially are somewhat similar to those of a true rush, and, like many of the true rushes, it also grows in moist soils in the wild. As mentioned earlier, there are silica deposits in the stems which give this horsetail its common name, and it was used by Native Americans for cleaning utensils. Superficially, scouring rush also looks like some of the restios because of the horizontal bands on the stems. The only other similarity to the restios, though, is that the stems won't grow back if you cut them. Scouring rush can be a striking accent plant for a container or a well-contained planter bed, but they can be awful persistent weeds in the ground in ornamental landscapes. They spread by underground, thin, fragile black rhizomes that break really easily when you try to pull them out, and they resprout really easily. Never ever rototill an area that has horsetails in it if you're wanting to get rid of them. The rototiller will just break up the rhizomes into small pieces and they'll all resprout. And never plant a horsetail directly in the ground unless the planter bed is really well contained. Horsetail can even come up through blacktop. It is possible to kill unwanted horsetails with glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, but bruise the stems lightly with a springtime rake first to increase absorption of the herbicide. This photo here was taken in April 2020 and shows an ornamental planting of scouring rush alongside the Palo Alto Medical Foundation offices on Soquel Drive in Santa Cruz, right next door to Pet Pals. It won't surprise me if within a year these horsetails are starting to come up through these cracks in the blacktop in the Pet Pals parking lot. This really is a persistent weed in the landscape. This photo here is of somebody's front yard in Santa Cruz where the scouring rush is just running amok. Never ever plant it in the ground. So let's take a look now at the true ferns. The true ferns have a slightly different set of botanical vocabulary for their physical structures. So let's start by running through that. What we'd call the leaf blade on a higher plant is just called the blade, or sometimes the lamina on ferns. The stipe is the equivalent of a petiole, and collectively the blade and stipe are referred to as the frond. The midrib of the blade here is the rachis. A few ferns have entire or simple leaves, but most are finely divided. A pinna is similar to a leaflet on a compound leaf in higher plants. So all of that is a pinna. Each pinna has a midrib called a pinna rachis or costa. And if the pinna is divided, each segment is referred to as a pinnule. Newly emerged young shoots are called croziers or fiddleheads. So let's look at the underside of a fern frond now. On the underside of fertile fronds, there are structures called sori or sori, and the singular is sorus. Sori are groupings of sporangia. A sporangium is a structure that contains spores. Each sorus may or may not have a thin membranous protective covering called an indusium. You should note that not all ferns have sori. Sometimes the sporangia can just be scattered across the frond surface. The sori are small, but still large enough to be seen with the naked eye. You usually need a hand lens, though, to see the sporangia and indusium. It's important to know that the production of sporangia and sori is seasonal. So if you don't see any, it may just not be the right season, or it's possible that you may be looking at a non-fertile frond, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Here's a close-up of the underside of a frond, showing the sori with the indusium starting to peel off to reveal the round sporangia underneath. For most of the ferns in cultivation, it's possible to memorize most of their names and their general appearance. Sometimes, though, we need to refer to a key to identify a fern, and these are the main characteristics that we'd be looking at to identify that fern. We'd look at the frond shape, the growth habit, the arrangement of the sori, the indusium, whether it's present or absent, and what shape it is. We'd look to see if there are any rhizomes and what color they are and what size, what thickness they are. We'd look at the stems. Are they thin, wiry, scaly, hairy? What's the color and the length of the hair? And do the pinnules get smaller towards the base of the stipe? And is there an auricle or an ear-shaped lobe at the base of the leaf? So let's look at a few of those in a little more detail, and we'll be talking more about these in our lab as well. Most ferns have fronds that are divided, but some have simple leaves that are entire, and the bird's nest fern, Asplenium nidus, is an example of this. Blades that are divided but not all the way to the midrib, are described as pinnatophyid. So here. And a good example of that would be our native Polypodium californicum, the California polypody. Blades that are once divided and each leaflet is not connected to the next one are described as pinnate. And Polystichum munitum, western sword fern, again one of our locally native ferns, is a good example of a frond that's pinnate. If each pinnule on a pinnate blade is itself divided all the way to its midrib, the blade is described as bipinnate. And then if it's divided 3 times, the blade is described as tripinnate. Some ferns produce 2 types of fronds, fertile fronds and non-fertile fronds. The fertile fronds are the ones which will bear sori. Ferns that have 2 types of frond are referred to as dimorphic, and commonly seen examples of this in California nurseries are Struthiopteris spicant, which used to be called Blechnum spicant, or the deer fern, which is pictured here on the right, Osmunda regalis, the royal fern, and staghorn fern, Platycerium. The picture on the right shows the deer fern, Struthiopteris spicant, at the UCSC Arboretum. The fertile fronds, the ones that are going to have the sori on the underside, are these tall ones right here. And these lower ones are the non-fertile fronds. The way that I remember which is which is that I remember that spores are usually wind dispersed. So if they're on the tall ferns, then they're much more likely to be blown away. This explanation probably doesn't have an awful lot of botanical significance, but I find that it's a really good way to remember which ones are which. I mentioned earlier that ferns display a range of growth habits, and while clumping ferns are the most commonly seen in nurseries, it's also important to remember that we may also see ferns that have a running or spreading growth habit. Some ferns are vining or climbing, and some are tree-like. Azolla, the smallest fern, is an aquatic plant and floats on the water surface. The photo here shows the spreading caterpillar fern with its striking silvery grey, thick rhizomes. This fern can be quite eye-catching when it's planted in a tall container or even in a hanging basket with those silvery rhizomes hanging over the edge. The position of the sori on the underside of the blade is important in identification, as is the shape of the sori. In the pictures here, you can see on the left the underside of a western sword fern blade. You can see that the sori are round and arranged fairly neatly in 2 parallel lines, either side of the pinna midrib. On the right is the giant chain fern, Woodwardia fimbriata. Its sori are also arranged in 2 parallel lines, either side of the pinna midrib, but they're linear in shape and look like little miniature strings of sausages. There are also sori on either side of the midrib of each pinna on the giant chain fern. Ferns in the maidenhair family usually have sori arranged around the outer edge of the underside of the frond. The leaf margin then curls under to form what's called a false indusium, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. The indusium is a thin protective membrane that covers each sorus on most ferns. Sometimes there might be ornamentation on the indusium. For example, the marsh fern family has hairs on the indusium. The direction in which the indusium peels away can also be an important identification characteristic. Here's an assortment of photos just to show you a very small sample of the shapes of various sori. It's important to know that not all ferns always have an indusium covering their sori. Some ferns have what's referred to as naked sori. And examples of ferns with naked sori include all ferns in the polypod family and our locally native Pentagramma triangularis, the goldback fern, which is on the right-hand photo right here. I already mentioned that ferns in the maidenhair family usually have their sori arranged around the outer edge of the underside of the frond. The margin of the pinule then curls under to protect the sori and forms what's called a false indusium. Other examples of ferns that have a false indusium are Pellia andromedifolia, the coffee fern or the coffee brake fern, and the Calanthes species, the lip ferns. The photo here is of two tree ferns in the garden of Shadowbrook Restaurant in Capitola. Look at the differences in the size and shape of the trunks and the density of the fronds in the crowns of these ferns. The fern on the left here, with the much more slender trunk and less dense crown, is the Australian tree fern. On the right, with this much thicker trunk and a much denser crown, is the Tasmanian tree fern. Maybe one way to remember what I've just said is that both thicker, as in thicker trunk, and Tasmanian both begin with a T. Here's another photo of the two tree ferns that I just mentioned. The photo on the left shows the Australian tree fern that's in the garden at Cabrillo, and you can see the distinctive circular scars that are left when the fronds drop off. On the right is the trunk of the Tasmanian tree fern that was in the previous slide, and you can see that the older fronds on the Tasmanian tree fern don't fall away so cleanly, and they leave a stub of the rachis or petiole attached to the trunk. And this is another good way of telling the difference between these two tree ferns, which are planted quite commonly in our local landscapes. So let's talk about how we can use ferns in the landscape. We can combine them with other greens and cool colors to create a relaxing, calm ambience in a landscape. We can combine them with plants with bold foliage, such as Fatsia japonica, philodendron, and farfugium. And we can use them to create a lush tropical ambiance. Ferns' tolerance of shade can make them good components of interior landscapes in homes, offices, and commercial buildings such as shopping malls and airports. But the fronds can easily dry out in these environments because of the lack of humidity. Some ferns can be tucked into rock cavities in water features to mimic their natural habitats. The maidenhair fern, Adiantum aluticum, is a good fern for doing this with. Many ferns obviously work well in shaded landscapes. Western sword fern, Polystichum munitum, works well in dry shade under California native oaks, where it combines really nicely with Douglas iris, Iris douglasiana, California fescue, island alum root, Heuchera maxima, and the hybrid cultivars of Heuchera maxima. Large evergreen ferns, such as our native giant chain fern and the southern hemisphere tree ferns, can be used as focal points in a landscape. And many ferns work well in containers, and some look really fabulous in a hanging basket, such as the Boston fern and the maidenhair fern. Compared to the seed-producing plants, ferns have limited wildlife value, and some of the creatures they do benefit probably aren't people's first choice for visitors to their garden. Slugs and snails are known to graze on the young shoots, and some beetles graze on the foliage. Mature ferns can provide cover for birds and small reptiles. And the photo here shows a banana slug slowly slithering its way down the frond of a western sword fern. As far as ferns being edible is concerned, the young fiddlenecks, not the mature fronds, of some ferns can be eaten by humans. And the examples of edible crosiers or fiddlenecks are those of the ostrich fern, the lady fern, and bracken fern. But it's really important to note that back in January 1990, the California State Office of Environmental Health added bracken fern to its list of known carcinogens. So probably not a great idea to be eating too many crosiers of bracken fern. Ferns typically don't suffer from many pests or diseases. In cultivation, problems are usually caused by poor cultural practices such as a lack of water, overwatering, or a lack of humidity. Symptoms of poor cultural practices include fronds drying out and turning brown and slow growth. Ferns typically require little maintenance. Dead or dying fronds should be removed by just cutting them off at the base. Containerized ferns may need feeding to prevent the fronds from turning yellow, and use a weak water-soluble fertilizer, not a strong one, as too high a strength may burn the roots. Remember that some ferns die back to the roots in response to heat or cold stress. This response is usually obligate, meaning it'll happen no matter how much water you give the fern. So be aware of this natural process and don't be tempted to overwater the fern during its dormant period, otherwise the roots and rhizomes will probably rot. Although many ferns prefer moist soil, they don't want to be in waterlogged soil. Some ferns prefer high levels of humidity and will dry out quickly in hot weather. Try to replicate the environmental conditions of a fern's natural habitat if possible, or choose ferns that are tolerant of your location and its conditions. Let's look at a few plants that look like ferns or are called ferns but aren't actually ferns. So there are a few plants that have the word fern in their common name, but they're not ferns, and a few more that look fern-like that you should be aware of so that you don't get confused. Sago palm, which is pictured right in the middle of the photo here, is a cycad and therefore a gymnosperm. It's not a monilophyte at all. Even though it looks like a tree fern with its deeply divided frond-like foliage and its trunk. So it's not a fern and it's not a palm either. Probably the easiest way, although not particularly botanically sophisticated, to tell that the sago palm isn't a fern is to touch the leaves. They're really thick and leathery and quite stiff, whereas most fern fronds are relatively soft. Young Canary Island palms also look somewhat fern-like when they're young and before the trunk has started to develop. Again, like the cycad, the leaves are quite stiff and leathery and not soft like ferns. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, is a plant we've looked at several times in class, and although the leaves look fern-like, it's not a fern, and I hope that all of you would feel confident about being able to identify yarrow. The asparagus ferns are named for their fern-like foliage, but they're actually angiosperms. They produce small, white, star-shaped flowers that are followed by red berries. Remember, ferns never produce flowers or fruit. They're physically incapable of producing flowers or fruit. So the photo here on the right shows a sago palm, Cycas revoluta, swamped in a sea of Sprenger's asparagus fern. Nothing in this picture is a true fern. So finally, let's do a quick summary of what we've covered in this lecture. The ferns are classified in a group of plants known as the monilophytes, which include the whisk ferns, horsetails, and the true ferns. The monilophytes are more advanced than the bryophytes and the lycophytes in terms of evolution, but all of these groups of plants share a similar reproductive system known as the alternation of generations, where there are separate, free-living haploid and diploid generations. The diploid sporophyte generation is the one that we're most familiar with. Ferns are typically associated with moist shade, but some species are adapted to xeric habitats and rocky substrates. The most common ferns in cultivation prefer shade and moist soils, but some are more tolerant than others of sun and drought. Ferns have a range of growth habits and forms, and these, along with a number of other physical characteristics, such as frond shape, sori shape and position, indusium or lack of indusium, and ornamentation, are used to identify ferns. Pests and diseases affecting ferns are relatively few, and the most common problems in cultivation are usually caused by inappropriate care. And lastly, take care not to confuse fern-like plants with the true ferns. Remember that ferns never produce flowers or fruit. Thanks for listening. When you have time, go back to Canvas and complete the quiz there that's on ferns and horsetails.